Yeah, I mean, so I've developed a version or tried to develop a version of higher theory that I could like understand. Um, and so I call that the higher order representation of a representation, which when I began, I thought it was kind of just your standard higher order theory. And then people start telling me no. So I was like, well, it's a version of the theory that at least I can understand. So I'll call it the horror theory. Um, Simply because that's what I think is important is that it's a representational theory of consciousness. And what I found in my own like educational trajectory was that people would always tell you that higher order theories are representational theories of consciousness. That's like in every introductory text. Higher order theories are representational theories come in two kinds, first order ones and higher order ones. And then they go on and then they don't really treat them like representational theories, or at least it didn't seem to me, because representational theories are kind of well known in first order circles. There's Michael Tye's panic theory, and where to have a representation that's conscious in the right way is to have it have it abstract and poised in the right way and have a certain content, blah, blah, blah. So, people have talked about what kinds of content and how it doesn't have to match the world. And so there's a whole debate about representationalism. Um, and it just seemed to me that higher theories were not really connected to that debate, even though people were going around saying they are a version of that kind of theory. Um, so I set out trying to say, well, okay, well, if you wanted to say the theory in those terms, what would you say? And that basically amounts to taking the idea of inner awareness and casting it as a kind of representation of one's own mind. So that makes it a way of trying to spell out in some detail what you mean. Because then you can say, well, what do you mean by a representation? And what do you mean by a representation of something that's mental? And how are these things going to actually be implemented in a neural system like ours? And then you get all the questions that arise. So myself personally, I wouldn't say I'm most attracted to that view. But what I would say is that I think that it should be taken as seriously as the other ones. And it's the one that's most often dismissed right out of hand. Because in effect, what it says is that when you experience red, that simply is an occurrence of a kind of like thought-like state with something like the content, I am seeing red, which has a lot in common with your ordinary thought. When you think like I'm seeing red, or that thing is red, or there's a red thing there, if you think that thing's red, then you're thinking about the object. So you're aware of the object there, in this case. If you think I'm seeing red, then you're aware of your seeing. So the idea is that the thought counts as a kind of awareness. The thought is a kind of representational state. And so my idea was, well, gee, I don't know if it's a thought or not, but it's a representational state. And the representational state will have concepts. And the concepts, we could talk about what kind of concepts figure in that state and how they relate to the experience according to the theory. And then what you would expect to find or not find according to this view. And so it straightforwardly predicts that you're going to get kind of mismatch cases, which is where I think where all the experimental results pay off.
Right. So just for people listening, would you mind going into that a bit further? So what has the experimental record of finding cases of mismatch and then fitting them into that theory what has that been like?
Yeah, so there hasn't really been much of a record yet because, I mean, I don't know how much of this anyone cares about, but in my opinion, there has been a large misunderstanding of like what the traditional version of the higher theory says. And therefore people have sort of misunderstood how you go about testing it. Some people really like the quote unquote misunderstanding, and it has become its own version of the theory, which I described as that relational version of the theory early. But at least in the way that David Rosenthal first presented, because he's kind of the main defender of this in modern times. If anyone's knows, he taught to graduate center for many years, but he's really done a lot of work trying to make higher order thought theories, this version where it's cognitive thought, like say, taken seriously. And there were other people who had, David Armstrong's another famous philosopher who was a higher perception guy, but since that time, there's been kind of a lot of ways of going, but the kind of way that many people have thought the theory goes is just that there's this first order state, then you have an awareness of it, and somehow the awareness of it makes the first order state the conscious state, so that this thing, like, it lights up, it turns on, it starts glowing with the phenomenal quality of redness or whatever. And if you have that version of the theory in mind, then you're going to go and try and find what you think of as the first order state, which is already hard to define in neural terms. But let's suppose that we think it's in the visual cortex. Then you're going to think that what you want to find the conscious states are going to be in the neural cortex. And in a way, the conscious state is ambiguous on the higher order theory because you're aware of the first order state. So that is the state that's conscious in the sense of you being aware of it. But what it's like for you to be in the state is determined by the higher order state. And that's kind of always confused people. So if you wanted to know what the experience of the person was like, you would look for the higher order state. If you wanted to know which state the higher order state was representing, so which state the person was aware of, you'd look for the first order state. So, so people have not really separated those two views out. It's only recently that people have started to sort of say, no, I officially declare I'm the one or I'm the other. For many years, there was just like people thought there was just this one version of the theory, because the idea that it could all just be this higher order thought-like state is a very bizarre view, that the experience of red is just like similar to a belief in this way, because they seem very different. I mean, my belief that things are red and my experience of redness seem from the inside to be somewhat different. I would say they both have experiential attributes. But anyway, so the point though is that on the version which doesn't allow the first order state to play the role in making it the experience change, you're going to have cases, or at least it seems conceptually possible that you would have cases where you have the first order state representing red and the higher order state representing something else like green. And that was kind of a traditional objection to the higher order theory when it first came out. Like, what do you say? Is it like red or like green? Is it the first order state that makes it like red? So if the first order state represents red and the higher order state says, I am seeing green, then it sort of seems like you have a choice to make. Like, which way, what is the person experience? So you could say, well, nothing happens. It's too weird of a case. You could say it's like what the first order state says, like it's seeing red. Or you could say it's like what the higher order state is like seeing green. And so people thought this was a kind of objection to higher order theories. And my strategy has been to try to argue that this is not an objection. It's just a rather surprising empirical prediction. So it's a kind of a consequence of the theory that you should be able to find cases like this. So let's experimentally try to set up those kinds of cases and see if we have any of that kind of evidence. As of yet, that's not really been done. Instead, what has been done is people who like this theory have looked at experimental work already done and try to interpret that work in these terms, whereas the other side has interpreted it in their terms. And what you have is like the experiments that are currently done, like Kane's blindness experiments and Sperling. If we want to talk about those, we can. But these various things that people have done, they weren't done to test this theory. But instead, people want to try to take that and interpret it and say, well, it's consistent with my theory, but it's consistent with the other one too. And so we've kind of argued to a stalemate. So it seemed to me that what you want to do is say, look, no, what we want is that to admit, first of all, that this is what the theory predicts, that in fact you could experience red without the first order state at all if you set things up in the right way. Now, first order states are going to be required in some sense causally to produce like the higher states or to give you the concepts or whatever. But if you invented a hypothetical thing, which I call a brain clamp, similar to a voltage clamp, where a voltage clamp is a neuroscience tool that allows you to keep a neuron clamped at a certain voltage so you can like test your various ideas about what ion channels do and so forth and so on. But if you could keep the first order activity clamped to a certain level, like at a constant level, and you could vary the higher order states, then according to this version of the theory, you would vary the conscious experience of the person. But because it doesn't matter in any way what the first order stuff is doing, it in terms of what it's like for the person. So that seems somewhat surprising, in fact, counterintuitive, that you could like be experiencing red even when your first order states were, representing purple or the sound of an oboe or anything at all, actually. And your behavior would be attuned to those first order states. So a first order state is one that, makes you aware of the external world. And by aware, we mean, informationally responsive, that you can do stuff. So if you have a first order state representing that something's purple, then you're going to behave in ways that suggest that you think that is purple. Like, for example, pressing a button, saying it's purple, classifying it in certain ways with the more blue things and less like the red things, and so forth and so on. Even all the while, we might say you go around saying that it's, red and experiencing it as red, so that the higher order theories typically want to cleave off these two different aspects. The first order states driving the behaviors, and the higher order states responsible for consciousness and whatever functionality consciousness may have. So that's a debate. So some higher order theorists think it has none, whereas like I think it has some. So I think that the higher order states, if they work in this way, will have an effect on the first order states, which keeps them active in the cognitive system. So you could think of it as like by becoming aware of the first order state, you now have the ability to send it to working memory, to direct attention to it. It can be routed for further processing so that you can figure out, more of the details or whatever. So whereas states that you're not aware of are going to fade away more rapidly, on my view, and not be around for this sort of selection and entering into the global workspace and all that other stuff that people talk about. So I do think that the consciousness has a function, namely that the higher order state has a function. But I don't think the phenomenology part has a function. I don't think that what it's like for you is doing that. It's just another aspect of the higher order state. So as far as predictions are concerned, then so if you wanted to test these different versions of higher order theory, you would want to find cases where you could disassociate the activity of the higher order element and the first order element, and then see whether you get these mismatches. So a relational version of higher order theory is going to end up saying, look, if you vary the first order state, then you're going to change the experience of the person. Whereas on the kind of view that I was just talking about, the horror theory, changing the first order state isn't going to change, as long as you could keep the higher state same, that is. It's not going to change the experience of the person. So there's an empirical prediction. If you could figure out how to set up a case where you could change one or, expect a difference at one, not the other, then you could differentiate these. And the same is true for, various first order theories and so on and so on. So I don't think, again, just like I was saying at the beginning, I don't think any of these are going to be like a knockdown, conclusive demonstration. But, within normal science, that's not what you ever get. But it would still be pretty surprising if the theory says, look, you could have an experience of a face even if your fusiform face area were damaged or missing, and then you could show that, in fact, that is the case. So first of all, you'd have to be relatively confident that that was like the first order area where face representations or activity was located, which is hard to do, it turns out. And then, you would want to have, so that would be very surprising. So that's what you would like. You want a theory that makes a surprising prediction. So that's cool. So I don't look at it as an objection. I look at it as like, as long as you can spell out the details, which is really hard, but assuming you could, then you have something that could actually be empirically tested. And rather, so in a way, I don't want to get all grandiose or anything, but in a way, it's sort of similar to like how I would view the EPR paradox in quantum mechanics, where it's like they wrote that paper as an objection, they were like, this is ridiculous. Look what would happen if your ridiculous quantum mechanics was true. And then they said, well, experimentally, let's test it. And yeah. So rather than simply a philosophical objection, it became a testable hypothesis that actually ended up supporting the original theory. And that's sort of in a way what I would like to see these misrepresentation cases be used as to say, look, you think it's an objection that this weird thing could happen, but let's go look. If it's weird, then it should be sort of refutable easily, right? So what are you waiting for? The problem with higher order theories generally is that they were formulated by philosophers, and especially by philosophers who weren't really interested in the brain at that time. So they're formulated at this total psychological level. It talks about awareness and first order states of awareness and higher order states of awareness. But how does that relate to what the brain is doing? So you need a whole separate set of arguments to say, well, okay, so where in the brain would that be? And it's not really clear that we know where in the brain any of these things would be. Although we have hypotheses. And so I think that you can say, well, if this is what you think they are, then you can look for it there. And if this is what you think they are, you can look for it there. But I don't think you're going to get anything more than that at where we're at right now.
The longstanding challenges of combining conceptual and empirical work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just to like illustrate this more concretely, like we've been talking about first order states and saying they're states of the awareness of the world. So where would you find those in the brain? Well, you might think it's obvious that if it's a visual state, it would be in the visual cortex maybe. But where in the visual cortex? Is it in V1, V2, V3, V4? Is it only the mid-level areas that matter, like some people would say? Or are the states in these other areas relevant? Or perhaps, like global workspace theorists think, the first order states are the ones that are globally broadcast. They're the ones, the states that count as awareness of things in the environment are the ones in the global workspace. So maybe and that would be states all the way in the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex. So they're well out of the visual cortex by the time they're in the workspace, one would think, depending on how you spell out the details of what being in the workspace means. So the point is that you might even think that first order states are in the front of the brain, as opposed to back here. It depends on what first order states are. So first order states are defined pretty clearly as awareness of things in the external environment, as opposed to awareness of my own mind. But then, yeah, well, gee, you could even be like a Dennetian, a Dennett person who thinks, there's no mapping from the mental states to the brain states, because these are like theoretical posits that are useful and describe the person, but that aren't neurologically real in any sense. They're just, what you have is a bunch of stuff happening in the brain, and then it's useful for us to describe it as, oh, here's a thought, there's a belief. But, anyway, so there's a whole range of views you could have about the relation of these psychological states to the neural states. And a lot of other theories of consciousness are like made up by scientists, and so are explicitly put in terms of like this part of the brain, that part of the brain. And the higher theory isn't exactly like that. So it allows for a lot of variation. I think it's not really that unusual, though, if you realize that first order theory simply means theory where inner awareness isn't invoked. And so there's tons of those kinds of theories. IIT, integrated information theory, is a first order theory. Global workspace theory is a first order theory. Michael Tye's panic theory is a first order theory. So, what unites those theories is simply that they deny a role for inner awareness. So there's a ton of different versions of first order theory. just like there's a ton of different versions of higher order theory. It's just that people haven't really paid attention because most people don't make it past that knee jerk reaction where they just go, "This is what we don't need that for consciousness," which is the reaction I had as well, by the way. But it just turns out that if you think about it more, I think that there's more interesting things. But I would love it if it were empirically disconfirmed. I mean, if it came back that this was wrong, then I'd be like, that's fantastic. So it wouldn't really bum me out. I don't really have, I sort of still think that, well, even though I don't think the higher order theories are like obviously false, I sort of think that they're intuitively weird. And also that every theory of consciousness is kind of a bit strange. So, something a bit strange is probably going to be weird, be true at the end of the day. And the higher theory should be counted amongst the strange views that we take seriously. I mean, if they're as should be taken as seriously as any other of our theories of consciousness, which they often aren't.
Right. I think it's really, really important to not feel like you have to identify with something and be a true believer, and just say you're interested in something, right? Like, I think that really, really holds us back when you have to tie yourself in so strongly with something you're just curious about.
It's true. I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure to like identify with a camp. And people always like saying, "You're a higher order theorist." And like to me, "You're a higher order guy, right?" It's like, well, I think it's an interesting approach. But yeah, I don't want to think of myself as like a higher order person. I think of myself as like a highly skeptical person who is deeply confused about a lot of these issues. And I have like, intuitions or convictions, but often I find myself arguing about these things as ways of trying to figure out what I myself think about things by arguing with people smarter than me and saying, well, here's what I thought was the case. Now tell me why it's wrong. Like, show me where, and then I end up changing my mind. So I feel like, when I first got into this stuff, I thought that certain things were obvious. Like I said, I thought this, when I first read this paper, I was like, this is obviously false. That was my immediate reaction because I sort of thought that you could tell which things were obviously false by your immediate reactions. Now I don't think that. I think that I had an experience of like getting to a point where I realized that I understood enough about philosophy and science to recognize that we weren't anywhere near having good answers. So that what we're trying to do is like explore the territory of what might count as a good answer because we're not sure. So we don't want to limit ourselves because, and that's why, panpsychism was on the table and the things that a lot of people might ridicule, I find worthwhile to think about because I really don't think that we have a good grasp on this stuff.